Day 16 of the 20-day flower creation journey. Welcome back to this channel. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Today we're going to paint together some tree peonies, which, as you can see from this book, are large flowers with many petals and a yellow center. I've already created a tutorial about peonies, but these peonies are very different in shape, so we are going to use a very different technique. As a first step, I start to take my filbert brush and I use the mixture that I already have on the palette with a little bit of magenta, and I created the very first layer. The first layer of petals is created by a similar shape using the belly and the side of my brush, and I started to create a very light layer where these brush strokes represent the inner petals. I keep changing the color value and the color hue of the inner petals, but I always try to stay in the pink red color because I try to recreate a peony that is quite similar to the color that I see on the book. I take the magenta color, and while the painting underneath is still wet, I started to add a few brush strokes that are of concentrated magenta. This will allow this concentrated magenta to blend with the underneath first layer and will create beautiful effects. Using the belly and the side of this filbert brush, I started to create the outer petals of this peony. This style is very loose, so don't be afraid to create these petals in a way that represents exactly what you see on the book or what you see on the page I'm recreating. I'm just leaving a little bit of space between the inner petals and the outer petals, so the paper will help to understand that these are different petals, but the shape of the petals doesn't have to be too precise and too similar to the picture that I have in the book. I keep adding a little bit of more concentrated magenta and I let it blend with the first layer underneath. To recreate this light pink color, I like to mix on the color palette a little bit of magenta and yellow ochre. The very first layer, as you can see, is very light. It's not very much concentrated, and the reason for this is that we want to build the dimension of this peony, creating layers of painting that start from the lighter and go towards the darker and more concentrated layers that we are going to create on top of the first layer. So I'm creating the bud on top of the first peony and I'm following the same process. I use a very light layer of magenta, a mixture mainly of magenta and yellow ochre, and I recreate this round shape of this bud on top of the first peony. I'm not too precise and too worried about the shape because still this is the first layer and we are going to build on top other layers afterwards. While the first layer starts to dry, I take my round shape brush. This is a round shape brush from Princeton in size 12, and I start to create the stems of these flowers. Stems are pretty thick and in green color, so this is what I am creating. I add a few leaves and I try to create these leaves by pressing on the paper my round brush and create these long leaves characterized by 3 tips. To create the leaves and the stems, I'm using mainly a mixture of subgreen, but I remind myself to change the color value by removing some of the pigment in the cup of water, and I also sometimes add a little bit of, for example, blue, this is cobalt blue, to create a different color hue, so a different color overall. This will allow this composition to have a variety of colors and to create a dimension overall the whole page. I keep adding these leaves where I see that there are white spaces and I feel they need to be covered. And I'm doing all of this while I wait that the first layer of these peonies is completely dry. Or even if it's not completely 100% dry, I like to start to add the second layer of paint when the first layer is at least, let's say, 90% dry. I keep following the reference picture to understand where to add the leaves, but I also use my, let's say, artistic interpretation of this picture to understand where to add leaves considering the size of my page and where I see white spaces that I have the feeling need to be filled. At this stage, the leaves are completed. I take my round brush in size 6, so this is a smaller brush, and I'm gonna start to mix on the palette a little bit of magenta and yellow ochre, and with this light wash I start to create the second layer of paint on top of the first one. Basically, I'm creating some round shapes, sort of round shapes, using the tip and the belly of my brush, and I start sort of highlighting some of the petals. It's like I'm creating some shades, some sort of areas that are darker, and in order to do so, I look at the reference picture to understand where to add these darker spots, this second layer, and I use a very light concentration of pigment on my brush. In order to do so, I create the color hue that I want to add on top of the first layer, and I remove part of the pigment in the cup of water. Therefore, I'm going to use this light wash, this light concentration of pigment to start to create these sort of round shape patches on the petals that I've created as a first layer. When I use this technique, I usually create the second layer using the same color that I've used for the first layer in different percentages, in different concentrations. But sometimes I also like to add a few bleeds that are in a different color. For example, here sometimes I add a little bit of red. In particular, this is Scarlet Lake from Winsor & Newton. And I keep adding these contrasting strokes as a second layer. Some strokes are just very fine lines. Some strokes instead are bigger patches. For example, I noticed that in this picture, the top part of each petal is much more concentrated in color, is sort of more red, more magenta color. Therefore, I try to add, where I've created the petals, a more concentrated and darker outline of these petals with this tip of the fine round brush. Sometimes I let the concentrated Scarlet Lake blend into this second layer I'm creating. Therefore, I just touch with the tip of this brush that contains a little bit of concentrated Scarlet Lake. I touch the second layer that is still wet, and therefore with the wet on wet technique we are going to achieve beautiful blending effects in the second layer. And then at this point I started to create the second layer of paint on the peony that sits on top of this page. I use a mixture of magenta with a little bit of yellow ochre, or magenta and a little bit of Scarlet Lake, and I keep creating these fine lines and these bigger areas with the tip of my brush and with the belly of the brush. I look at the reference picture to understand how to place these darker areas, but I also follow my instinct and I just place them where I think they would look nice. Basically, with the second layer of paint, I want to give more definition to what I've created underneath. And so sometimes I keep adding a few strokes to give more dimension, and I keep refining, looking at what I've created and having an overall overview of what I've painted. It takes me time sometimes to understand where to add some of these darker areas. I have to say that I'm still experimenting and I'm still finding a perfect way to add these brush strokes as a second layer. And so this process might take a little bit of time. This said, I encourage you to try if you like to add some darker areas in the way I'm doing, and give yourself some time to understand where to put these brush strokes, and even allow yourself to make some mistakes to understand where to add in the next painting better brush strokes to have a better result of what you're trying to paint. Remember that learning how to paint in watercolor, especially adding layers, takes time. So don't be too hard on yourself. Give yourself time to experiment, time to understand how the process works, and you will obtain beautiful results. At this point, I'm adding with the tip of my brush and in color yellow ochre the center of this peony. I just create some small dots with the very tip of the brush and some fine lines that resemble overall the center that I see in the picture. I mix on my palette a darker green where I mix a little bit of magenta with sap green and a little bit of blue, for example cobalt blue. And with this darker green, I refine the shape of the leaves and I create some fine lines on the leaves. I'm trying to give a little bit of more definition on the leaves too, as I did on the flowers in first place. And at this point, we are reaching the end of this tutorial. I hope you had fun and you learned something painting these 3 peonies. I hope to see you on day 17.